together. And you see, every time we lose somebody we've trained, um, for instance, we have Pat Conway. See, we had to let Pat Conway go. We had to let Lynn. What? Then we'd like to entertain some questions about not only planning, but how everything that you have listened to thus far can fit into that planning in terms of what faces you as teachers in the Suffield system in the fall. Obviously, there's no point in investing the time in being here listening to all this if now it didn't have a bearing upon the pattern by which you use your energies as a teacher in this system. It's a waste of time to put in time to have new information if that new information does not have a bearing upon your personal use of energy as a professional. Well, let me talk about some basic elements of planning, and then we'll just join in a general discussion. First of all, planning itself has to be planned. And this is where people often make a mistake. They don't set any preliminary plans for the planning itself, and therefore it's expected to happen by itself, but it won't. The quality of a planning session is determined by some preliminary plans for that session, and this is almost never granted. And what happens is, of course, you call people together for the planning session, and you will find it doesn't get off the ground very well because it hasn't been planned for. And so what happens is that everybody fumbles around for quite a while. And I've almost never seen it happen that it dawns on the group that the reason they're having trouble is that the planning session was never planned for. And therefore, not realizing that, there's this fumbling around to get off the ground. So if you're going to have a planning session, some small group needs to lay preliminary plans for that planning session. And then the people who come to do it need to have a clear sense of what it is they are to do. It may be that you want a brainstorming session. And if that's what you want, then you set things up a little differently. And the amount of time you spend on it will be different. And people then get oriented to it before they get to it a little differently. So, planning itself must be planned. That's a little point that Mag gave me this morning in the car, which I thought was really right on target, because we ourselves have kind of come to a meeting, and we didn't plan for the meeting, even though the meeting was a planning meeting, and then you have to fumble around for quite a while. And this is largely because of time constraints. I think people often don't do things as well as they might, not because they don't know better, but because they're operating under constraints. And that's why we have to be charitable and long-suffering and forbearing with each other, because we're all operating under constraints. And sometimes that's not appreciated enough. Any planning session has to operate under the umbrella of some purpose. Have you ever attended some of these tea groups where there is no purpose? Well, I went to one or two of them and I just left because, my life is too short to sit around in a group while this group fumbles to decide to do something and then come up with something totally trivial and useless to do. Now, I suppose that the experience of learning how to tolerate anxiety and frustration in such an experience may have some use, but I think once is enough for an intelligent person. And to go on week after week after week with it doesn't seem to get anywhere, in my opinion. So you need a general overall purpose, and that's what the model provides. It says the general purpose of education is to actualize the potentialities of children and the staff who are teaching them at an optimum rate. And the whole body of theory that we have generated is designed to provide guidelines for action, for energy use, to accomplish that objective. The purpose itself will be general and broad, and it will be hard to operate on it directly. That's why it has to be transformed down into objectives and goals. These objectives and goals then must at some point have operational expression. By operational expression, I mean that the terms used suggest the evidence that would be acceptable for you. Evidence that you would accept as proof that the objective had been achieved. That means then they ought to be expressed in terms of the learner. This comes right down to your own classroom. When you say, yes, I want to actualize the potentialities of the kids that I'm working with at an optimum rate. I want them to become competent learners in all these areas. And therefore I'm going to involve the children in activities, interactions with specific environments to achieve certain objectives. And that's what your plan will center around. Once you have the goal set, phrased in operational terms of the learner, in other words, you might say, all my children at some time during this year will be able to identify the entire alphabet. They will know the range of letters and the sounds that they make, and they will be able to translate any given sound into sets of letters. You might say that as a general objective, and you probably want to be fairly flexible about that in the sense that some children will be more developmentally advanced than others, and you won't be able to do this, reach this objective for all children at a specific time. But that gives you the direction for all children to be developing in, and you will be able to work with each child in order to push him along in that direction. The reason I mention that is that one of the chief distinctions between traditional educational planning and the educational planning that ANISA envisages is that we always take into consideration the child. The plans must be for specific children. Now, if you look at lesson plans, and I have looked at just reams of them, that teachers have to turn into their principals, these plans are in terms of the subject matter only, usually organized by textbooks. But the children are not included in the plan. Which means that there isn't the attitude and orientation towards the individualization of instruction. See, otherwise the child, who's the critical variable in the whole operation, would be included. And, of course, by the time you write up such a plan for 30 kids, it means if you've got 30 children, you have 30 plans. By the time you wrote them all up, the week would be over and you wouldn't have had any chance to be with the children. That's why the theoretical approach is the better approach, because it enables you to work on this plan without having to write everything down, though some things you will certainly want to write down because it's just too complicated to remember. Now, any good plan has an evaluation scheme built into it so that there are feedback loops where you are collecting information, making observations to keep you on the track. When you get information that things aren't going well, you need to modify right away what you're doing. Otherwise, the feedback will be relatively useless. And it is in most agencies now. For instance, if you take Title I projects all over the state, there is a request for refunding before the evaluation of the year is up, so that the replanning for the following year has nothing to do with the evaluation completed. It's not because educators prefer doing it that way, it's because state and federal funding cycles compel it, because they don't care. They're not individualizing the financial arrangements of the system to meet the needs of the public school system anyway. They're going to have mindless operations, so that all that money that is put into evaluation are just documents put on the shelf. But people go on doing what they were doing anyway. They don't really examine that and decide what effects it has. So that don't waste time collecting information if you're not going to use it, for heaven's sakes. And if administrative agencies require it, then I think they have to make sure they're going to use it. Because otherwise it's too costly, it's a waste of money. Now, every plan has to have built into it flexibility, because you cannot foresee everything. The future has a way of having some surprises. and therefore the plan's got to be flexible enough so that you can go to plan B and plan C and plan D in case the contingencies that you've organized for plan A or B or C aren't met. So flexibility has got to be built into this operation. Now there are 4 levels of planning that may impinge upon you. One has to do a planning of what you're going to do to accomplish specific objectives of the curriculum, what you're going to do with those children. Another level of planning has to do with collaborative planning with other people who are going to be working with you with those children, namely curriculum specialists. We've already talked with curriculum specialists here about that. And I think the response that they have made is such that any teacher who wants to have some time can request some time. They may not get it because of the constraints of the system at the moment. But your desire to plan with a curriculum specialist to provide a more organic, whole, integrated approach to the education of children, that possibility is clearly here for development, and we have some plans for that for the next year, which will unfold as we see how things are. Thirdly, there should be some plans for parent volunteers, if you have any. If you don't have any and you want some, you can get some. But don't have parents come in, stand on one foot, and then stand on the other, not what to do. There must be some plans for using the energies of those parents. Now, that may mean that you have to have a little training of those parents. If you don't do that, you will suddenly find that you're assigning parents rather dull routine operations like clean up the john, sweep up the floor, go get me some paper, and you're going to lose them. See, they need to know how to work with the children, and part of your plan ought to include, if you're going to use those kinds of ancillary personnel, some things that can be built on so that you don't have the burden of getting this parent to do a little thing here, and a little thing there, and a little thing here, which is so distracting. What you want to do is get a sequence of things that may last 6 weeks or 3 weeks that the parent can logically progress through with a little bit of orientation. Ultimately, we would have assistance to help organize and integrate ancillary personnel like that. Then there is a level of planning for getting children involved with things in the community. This might mean such things as field trips, going places. It might involve having other resource people of the community come in to do things. I think the more you tap talent in the community to come in and do things for the children, the more integrated the educational experience will be and the less fragmented it will be. Now, above all, I think the kind of educational planning we're interested in is to enable teachers to escape the tyranny of textbooks, which are a great boon to teachers. I mean, they don't see it as tyranny. They see it as as a source of salvation. And we're not down on textbooks as something to be thrown out by any matter of means. The research that goes into the production of those textbooks, you could never finance on a local school level. But if you just use a textbook and go through it and you don't consider the children or the conditions of those children and where they are, and they don't integrate that information and experience with everything else, then you have fragmentation, and that's going to be a problem. So that gives you a kind of a generalized view. Mag and Don may have some things they would like to add to that, and if they do, this would be a time to add it. I know Don says, well, you didn't leave anything you didn't leave anything left over to add, but I can't. I mean, this is just, I've already said things that Mag talked with me and Don talked to me about in the car coming over, so in a way I may have taken the wind out of their sails.
You surely did.
Well,
that's all right. Now, most of us have to speak from our own experiences, like you yourselves. And my, I guess, almost 20 years of public school experience now leads me to suggest, at least, that planning for the most part, is done by an individual teacher with individual children, at least through the various systems I had to come through. And for the most part, I label myself as a bootleg teacher for the most part, because in some instances I had very little cooperation from school principals in the sense of trying to plan a curriculum for individual children. There was always the notion that, the general notion was that let's keep everything together. There wasn't much leeway for diversity of teachers or of children. So if I didn't fit in the mold, like all of the teachers in the sense of turning in those lesson plans every Monday morning, then that kind of puts you on the skids for getting tenure and such things. That hasn't been too bad an experience in my life, because I learned how to scheme like mad and to plan like mad to do things for my kids. I say my kids very possessively, but I'm not fanatic about the thing. But somehow the children were the most important things to me, beings in the school setting, and everything I ever did had to focus in on that. So when the principal asked me to stay for a football game, which I enjoyed and liked, or to chaperone the dance, or to take up the lunch money, I always figured out a way to get the children to do all those things that they could carry on for themselves. And that allowed me more time to do something about the content and the process objectives that we were trying to achieve. So I built into a lot of the system as much flexibility as possible in order to accommodate the goal of getting these children on the cutting edge of their destinies.
You know, I've had the experience of being with Mag on a plane and having one of her students meet us in the airport accidentally. A student whose destiny and whose potentiality would have remained repressed, oppressed, and never seen the light of day had Mag not worked with that student in the course. This would be a student, say, in the second, third, fourth, fifth, whatever grade she was teaching, who suddenly found the escape hole in the system by virtue of coming to recognize their own worth and having had Mag impart, in essence, the necessity for the structuring of a self-ideal that projected that child out of that limited, provincial, repressed, racial situation wherever they were, so that they sensed that there were possibilities there. And there's just those kinds of people that Mag released from that imprisonment, scattered all over this country. And every now and again, when I'm with her, we bump into them. So there must be quite, I don't know how many there are, but to just randomly bump in as many as I have must mean there are quite a few sprinkled around.
In the town where I worked, there was a department store in Nashville, Tennessee called Harvest, and they had a slogan that said, "Harvest never knows completion." And somehow that caught on with me.
They were Whitehead Inns, weren't they? Yes, well, they must have been.
Yeah, surely, maybe so. But that whole idea it struck me as being very influential in terms of my own self-worth in working with youngsters, that they could just keep going and going and going. And this is the reason I could never stick with a lesson plan over 2 minutes or 2 days or whatever. I know some of my colleagues had the lesson plan books from years, and so when they get all these principals who would demand all these things, all they did was just kind of switch them around, change a few dates, and these were plan books they had 5 years ago for the class. And if you were in the school system where this year you have 5th grade, and the next year you know you're going to have 6th grade, and the next year the 7th grade, well, you can find ways to, just scheme and change dates and the like on that same thing. But this particular little slogan just, kept me on the cutting edge, I think, of a lot of things. And because plans were complete, but the moment they were completed, there was something else, because every integration a child makes, he's ready for something new. And if you've got the same darn plan, it just doesn't work.
That's right, because you have to be right there with individualizing, and that there's no way you can foresee that. But if you have the theory, then you can act on the spot. That's the point.
Maybe they have questions or comments.
How about you, Don?
Dan,
Yeah.
let me address one of the things that you're also aware of, and that is the time planning. And I think that certainly one of my goals in the coming year would be to see what we could do about releasing teachers for more planning time. Now, if we, in the past, in order to bootleg some time for planning, using Mag's word, we used our specialists poorly. We used them back to back to release teachers. And that was the greatest thing ever, but 6 years ago. To think that teachers could be relieved from the classroom for half an hour to have a little in-school planning time. But now we know that we probably did children a great disservice by taking these specialists and having them work with large groups of classes. How can you find out how children operate when you're working in an art class or a music class or whatever with 25 children? So I don't know how we're going to get around this, but I think that one of the things we have to talk about is that children don't need a teacher 5 hours a day. They can be left on their own. They can be left with other people, not just specialists. However, we do have to get around that old chestnut of the legal thing. If a child is hurt without a certified person around, you could open yourself up. We had an incident this past year now at Bridge Street. All 8 of our teachers, as you know, Mag, were planning on Thursdays. Every teacher was out of the classroom, and the children were left with volunteers and with aides and so forth. And it worked out very well, I would say. Teachers got a lot of satisfaction from this, and I think the children did too. And we only had one incident all year that made me a little nervous because a child did get a chipped tooth while a volunteer was in the room. Nothing came of it.
The volunteer didn't chip it, did he?
No.
No, well.
But you see, we have the hang-up, Dan, of should we leave these children?
Sure, I know.
Am I right? You people feel the same thing?
Sure.
Well, if you watch them break their arms, it's all right, you see, but if you're not
Yeah.
watching when they break them, you can get sued. That's the legal step.
Does the law state that somebody has to be legally, officially, someone, meaning a certified teacher or a paid employee, has to be assigned the responsibility for those youngsters, whether or not they're present? Or do they actually have to be present? See, the law is stated different ways in different states, and in some places, there has to be some document someplace or some evidence that somebody who's a paid employee, it wouldn't necessarily have to be a teacher, has been assigned the responsibility for those youngsters.
Yeah, but you see, we can't really do that, Don, because we have 2 paid aides in Bridge Street School and 8 classrooms. Therefore, we have to use volunteers
yeah.
who are not paid.
But you see, the question is, does Connecticut require that the person who's responsible be present? In some states, all they have to do is to make sure somebody's responsible. Now, it may be that if there's the constraint that somebody who's responsible has to also be present, that's a much more severe problem to work around than if they merely just have to be. You see, and so negligence, therefore, in that kind of state is determined on the basis of whether or not somebody's been assigned.
I see. I'm not sure.
It'd be interesting, it may be useful to find out. A certified teacher has to be, which is even a more severe.
And isn't that a local insurance situation? Yeah, it's not.
I think it is.
Not a local.
Well, part of the time, I think planning relates to diagnosis and prescription, which involves, to use the terminology, a sampling of the child's imminence and a provision for his transcendence. And one of the things that I found useful when I taught math, well, let me just explain what the situation was. I had 7 classes ranging from 35 to 43 youngsters coming at at 35 to 40-minute intervals. So it's like trying to teach on a conveyor belt. You know, the kids are coming and going. And so in a situation like that, you either throw up your hands and use the drive all the cattle with one stick, or you try to improvise or individualize within the constraints of that impossible situation. And one of the things too is that the teacher has to be on the move. In other words, you cannot teach from one place. Once you get the youngsters involved in whatever the assignment is, and then you circulate. Now, a lot of teachers will just circulate and interact with the youngsters and provide assistance and so on. See, I found it useful to have each youngster have a little card which had two parts on it. One related to whatever he was doing successfully, and the other side had to do with what he needed to work on. That card was present, and I had a card with the answers to the problems that he was working, so that if there's a review sheet that had different operations, as I looked at the youngsters, and of course the business of immediate feedback is necessary, so that as I looked at what a youngster had completed to that point, I had a card with the answers I could quickly check and then let him know which ones were right and which ones were wrong, so that I could either assist him with the ones that he had missed, or if it were just a technical error, he'd know which ones were wrong so that he could rework them before going on. And then on his card, which had to do with what he knew and then what he needed to address then, the immanence and transcendence, I could indicate what operations he had mastered, what seemed to be the problem, or what seemed to be the thing that needed to be addressed, and that was on this little card, so I could collect the cards. And then in terms of planning for the next day, you have the database for then determining. And you can also plan on the next, if you know the materials pretty well, you could say that, well, it looks like you're having a problem here with division of fractions. And so you can do some planning right on the spot while you're taking care of all these other responsibilities. One has to be efficient like that in a situation that imposes such severe constraints. I found that useful. And I also, and it may be just unique to a handicap, I have difficulty holding all information in my head. That's why I say that if I lose my briefcase, I might as well quit the profession. In terms of keeping records, those little cards then were always available in that desk, and the youngster kept the same desk, so that I could just pull the card out. I had a sense of the plans for him at any given moment.
That's a little easier on that level. It's a little harder when
That's
you're
right.
working with 5, 6, and
Yeah.
7 years. And I think that when we're talking about planning, I think we're talking more in terms of this flexible grouping that we have, that our children may have as many as 3 different teachers.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to
Right.
orchestrate this whole thing with our specialists and trying to get a real good program for each child. And that's what we're talking about when we say planning.
Sure.
And as we're set up now, there's little time for that type of planning.
Well, I think it is something that has to be worked on. And if there are means whereby faculty members in the school system are permitted to make input or to have any say over their own destinies as professionals in the system, then those channels provided ought to be used as a means of getting some of that planning time. And then you have to live with whatever the constraints there are, but there's no reason why you can't keep politely fussing to get whatever is required in order to go in that direction. If you don't, of course, other agencies will make decisions for your destiny. Now, we envisage that our own experience has told us that for every hour of top flight teaching, you really need 3 hours of preparation. Now, you never get it. But somehow, in the future, teachers in the schools we design, teachers will have a part of their day away from children to make plans for the following day. It's got to be that way, ultimately. You wouldn't expect a surgeon to go in and perform 8 open heart surgeries in a day, back to back. No, if he does 1 a week, that's as much as he can take. And he will do a tremendous amount of planning and data collection on the patient before he decides. Got to be free from infection, blood count's got to be this, blood sugar level's got to be this, he's got to be on a special diet for 3 or 4 days before you do it. And you see, if you just wheel him in on the conveyor belt like we do in education, you know, you're just going to bury some, you're just going to lose too many patients. See? And that's an ideal towards which we ought to work. Now, you know, in Hamden, we did get a half day every week. Those ANISA teachers in McGraw are off every Wednesday afternoon. So starting at 12 noon on Wednesday, from 12 to 4, or as late as they want to stay, they get together and organize what they're going to do for the next week. Sue, you want to speak to that for just a little bit?
Well, I don't know.
There's not too much more to say than that, except that when the ANISA team goes up there, we only up there once a month, but outlines are made of things that need to be done, and then they have time allocated to start working on that.
Well, the nice thing is that all the teachers from the age group can meet at the same time. Or they can meet with teachers from other age groups. And they can meet with the specialists, so everyone's free at the same time.
See, if everybody's not free at the same time, then the collaborative planning goes out the window. That's the thing we were talking about when we were working with the
I was
specialists.
just going to point out that Glastonbury, Connecticut's been doing that for years, and there are other towns that do it.
Yeah.
Having a release day every week, every Wednesday afternoon. And they've had it for, I don't know, 115 years.
So there's no state law prohibiting it.
No, we had it here and lost it.
Well, you
When
see,
it first came, it was here.
if teachers abuse that time, and the public sees them in the beauty parlor getting their hair done on in-service training day, then of course they're going to take it away. You see.
The teachers were saying that they'd rather be in school teaching than have this time off, and same as in the community, so I guess they lost it.
You see, the irony of it all is that if they found a teacher who was dealing inappropriate with youngsters, they wouldn't abandon schooling. I mean, why would the abuse of something necessarily be the basis for doing away with it?
No, what you do is say, you get with it now. Shape up, sure. Well, what would be the possibility, just to speculate, Eileen and Ed and Dick, where's Dick going? What would be the mechanism for reintroducing this possibility?
Well, we got more release days for next year, but it's only for the purpose of teacher evaluation. I think, are there 5 days built in? And we got 5 more days
Yeah,
this
we've
year.
got-
But if you don't give a teacher time to plan,
Yeah.
he won't be worth
That's not-
evaluating.
That's not good. Very discouraging. Gotta have someone.
Well, what would be the precise administrative mechanism for getting such a thing moving?
Well, we've tried it, and I don't know what the mechanism would be, but we've tried it. And one of the answers we get is sort of the attitude of the townspeople as far as, you know, time off, once a week or whatever it is. I think it would have to be an education process for the tounspeople to show them what we would do rather than.
It seems to me that a proposal could be made about it, and let this proposal then be made public, and let there be some hearings to discuss why it is. I mean, we'd be glad to come down and make the case, help you make the case within the context of ANISA. I think the case can so easily be made for people who have any reason. Now, if you're saying the town is not filled with people who are reasonable.
This might not be true, but it's sort of the reason we're keeping it. 10 years ago, we had like every Wednesday afternoon off or something like that. And I don't really remember why it was taken away from us.
I
No?
think,
Well, yeah, I guess so.
I think we ought to investigate also. I think both the middle school and the high school teachers have release time every day for planning. I think it's only the elementary school it does not have.
That's
And I
exactly.
think that's because we've had many years of high school teachers doing our negotiable
Right.
items.
Well, I just
Through the
learned,
SEA and the contract, you know?
I learned last week, Gail, that the SEA made the recommendation that the elementary schools be given early release time, be given planning time. Well, how that could be facilitated, the SEA didn't spell out. That's for us to wrestle with. And when you're wrestling with the yellow buses, there's really not much way you can get for you.
Well, it's a question of money, but I think that a case can be made. Teachers at the middle school, maybe rightly, spend much less time with the students
That's
each
right.
day than teachers at the elementary school.
That's right. and
I'm
we
not sure I
point
could
to-
stand the middle school students all
Difference
day
in
either.
the ratio of staff to pupils.
Absolutely.
So what do
That's
they-
where it is, very basic. There's your answer right there.
Sure, and what do? They cut the staff in the Anissa program. And that's the first indication in my 6 years when parents rose up and said, we will not stand for this. So the parents in the two little schools went to finance board meetings and they got a teacher reinstated. And you know, that, one of the reasons, I think we've got to do more education of our administration and our board and all the rest of it, because that never should have happened. If they really knew what we were doing in those two little schools, it never would have happened. But if you don't know what's going on,
Sure.
it's easy to say, well, let's save $12,000.
There's an election in November, and the Board of Finance chairman is up, and 2 members of the Board of Education are up, so.
There's a
your
chance,
answer.
there's a chance,
Right?
sure. Well, let me talk about what we would like to do after we come back from the coffee break. During the coffee break, we would like you to find a group that you'd like to work with, just informally. If you want to be assigned to a group, we'll find one to assign you, but we'd rather not. And once you see what we'd like you to do, this will give you an idea of what group you might want to join. We do have some specialists here, and you may want to join up with a specialist and see how you can now do some collaborative planning for that. But we'd like you to get together after the coffee break in a group or two, a group of 2 or 3 or 4, and to say to yourself, this was something I was going to do in this way, but with this information now, I'm going to replan it in this direction. I'm going to try something out. Because if we do not provide you with the opportunity of now integrating this information in your thinking about, in a way that exerts an influence on the future, then we will have been wasting our time coming down here, and so will have you been wasting your time coming here, except it's been a very pleasant time for us. And I suppose a little love, fellowship, and unity is always a good idea, but there are other things to be achieved other than that. And then at 1 o'clock when we come back, we would like to hear each group specify what it is. Some of you may want to take a long-range plan and provide just the general framework of it. Some might want to look at a short-term plan, which would be just a single educational experience that might go on for only 1 day or 1 afternoon or 2 days. And keep in mind 3 things as you're doing the planning. One is the specification of the objective. What is it you want to accomplish out of this, phrased in operational terms of the learner? Secondly, look at that objective in terms of content and process. Now, you won't be able to tease out all the processes that will be touched nor all the content, but have an idea of what the minimum is you'd like to accomplish. Because if you don't do that, at the end of it, you won't know whether or not you got where you wanted. Thirdly, think in interaction terms. You won't know the children yet, so you can't build the children into this little planning at the moment. But that is where the plan has to be adapted when you look into the eyeballs of the children. But in terms of interaction, there is an environment there. So you need to think as a part of your planning, what are the basic elements of that environment you need? In other words, if you're going to have a bus, well, all right, then that's going to be it. You just jot what those might be. Then consider whether it's going to be whether you're going to have ancillary personnel that you must organize and integrate into this, or whether you're going to be using a specialist, or whether you're going to do it just to yourself and the kids. In other words, those are some of the elements that have to go into it. Our experience has been, without a doubt, that planners are the people who make things happen. They have the future. Those who don't plan, the future happens to them. And many times, such non-planning types are always wondering what's happening because they never have any input in anything, because they never just decided that there could be some input. Really, people make assumptions that they have no control over their destinies. And the fact that they make that assumption robs them of the power to have control over their destiny. I'm sure within the Suffield system there are just no end of possibilities of things you can do that will open up doors in extraordinary ways for these children and make you the happiest teacher going. I don't think you can be terribly happy if you're teaching back to back out of a textbook and you're just cranking these people through. But if you can open it up, apply these theories, and roll with the developmental needs of the children, and have your developmental needs factored into that, so that you're growing and developing and keeping up, then it makes the profession very much more, it has what the French call the élan vital. There is a principle of excitement in life that is built into it because there is the actualization of potentiality. Now, that statement of what our objective will be after we come back for coffee, I hope is specific enough. We will be circulating around a little bit and be happy to join any group and talk about it to help look at some possibilities.
Yeah, I'd like to insert.
Mag, you want to add something?
Yes, just one thing. You need not plan for it specifically, but I would like to see us begin to individualize our in-service training to this extent. Those of you who've been together this week have an edge on those who were not here. And to have you repeat, because some of you were kind enough to repeat even though you were here last year, but you didn't get it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So in that regard,
I don't know whether I should say hee-haw or...
So I don't think it was that bad. But we have some specifications, one of which we intended to introduce this summer on physical causality. I would like to have Dr. Pattabhi Raman to come at some point during the year. You could plan, this group if you would like, and have him go through that specification with you, because you can use it at the upper levels as well. And there will be any number of those that you could plug in terms of your in-service plan. Now, you may have curriculum plans that include some other kinds of things, because technically and legally, ANISA isn't at the 4th and 5th grade levels and so on. So you might have other plans in mind. But I wish you would think about possibilities of using the specifications. I think they will mean something now. They will be much more meaningful now that you have all of the theoretical background and everything to handle them. And you can go up or down, complexify the tasks suggested in there, and go with the development as far as you can. And if you find, some of those things don't quite in the way we've suggested, then give us that kind of feedback. So that's a possibility to keep in mind in terms of your long-range planning, at least.
So don't forget, Barbara is here, and Jackie and her temporary replacement, is that the way to say it? Yes. And you are now seeing what the central role of the arts is in the ANISA curriculum. And so I think these people should be seen by everybody else here. If they are working in your school with your children in any way, shape, or form, they should be seen as extraordinary resources for seeing the connections between art activities through music and through the visual arts and their relationship to other parts of the curriculum. So that you may want to tangle with the specialists who are here. So after we come back for coffee, some will be in here, but there are all the tables out there, the round tables in the library, and you can simply go grab one of those tables and get started. Now, when we report back this afternoon, we'd like to have the spokesman for the group specify the objectives, process, content, and indicate what the interactions are, specifying what the environment is, so that we can give you some feedback on this as you give them. Barbara?
Do you want Jackie and I, for instance, to be plugged in with just one group, or would it be more helpful if we could do kind of consulting with